If you ever visit Blackthorn Pass, you'll hear stories. Hikers whisper about people who went in and never came out. Locals lower their voices when they talk about the woods, as if the trees themselves might be listening. And those of us who work here, like me, figure out real quick that there's something inside those trails that doesn't belong in any ordinary forest. Something that isn't natural. I didn't believe the rumors at first. I thought people just loved telling spooky campfire tales to scare off newcomers. But now, after everything I've witnessed, after the things I've heard and the things I can't explain, I follow the rules. Every single one of them. No exceptions. No questions. Because, if you break the rules, you don't come back. You might be wondering, what's so dangerous about a simple nature tour? What could possibly be hiding in the middle of a scenic hiking trail that makes grown adults disappear? I'll tell you. And, one more thing. If you ever visit Blackthorn Pass, remember the rules. Hi, my name's Ethan Grant, and I work as a tour guide at Blackthorn Pass. It's my job to lead hikers, birdwatchers, and adventure seekers through the thick forest trails, showing them rare birds, old oak trees, and breathtaking views that make the trip worth it. Most days, it's exactly what you'd expect, a quiet, peaceful job surrounded by nature. But there's another side to it. Every time I take a group into those woods, I follow a strict set of rules. Not because I want to, but because I have to. These rules aren't just for safety. They're for survival. And, I learned that lesson the hard way. On my first day, my boss, Franklin, handed me a laminated sheet of paper. It looked like a normal set of instructions at first. Until I actually read it. The list wasn't long, but something about it unsettled me. The words felt final. Rule 1. Never enter Blackthorn Pass after 5:30 p.m. If you're still inside by sunset, you will not leave. Rule 2. If you hear a bell ringing in the trees, stop walking and cover your ears. Do not move until it stops. Rule 3. If you see a pile of stones in the middle of the trail, do not touch them. They aren't for you. Rule 4. If a stranger joins the tour group midway, check their feet. If they're barefoot, do not acknowledge them. Rule 5. If the forest goes completely silent, all at once, turn around and walk back the way you came. Do not run. Do not look behind you. Rule 6. If you hear someone calling your name from the forest, it is not one of us. I remember looking up at Franklin after reading it, waiting for him to crack a smile, to tell me it was all some kind of elaborate prank. Instead, he just stared at me, serious as ever. "You'll understand soon enough," he said. I laughed it off at first, thinking it was just some spooky gimmick to give the tours an extra thrill. A little folklore to make things more interesting. Then, I led my first solo tour. It was a small group, just 3 tourists. A couple from Chicago, Daniel and Laura, and a solo backpacker named Josh. They all seemed excited. Eager to experience what they called the untouched beauty of Florida's wilds. Daniel had a camera slung around his neck, already snapping photos before we even left the main path. Laura was chatty, asking me about every bird we passed. Josh, on the other hand, had that restless energy of someone who had been on a dozen hikes before and was always looking for the next perfect shot. The first half of the hike went smoothly. I pointed out a group of blue herons by the water, a few alligator nests hidden among the reeds, and an ancient cypress tree that had been standing for over 500 years. It was the kind of scenery people traveled miles to see. They took pictures, talked about how peaceful it all felt, and, like most tourists, completely ignored my warnings to stick close together. We were about halfway through when I checked my watch. 4:35 p.m. Plenty of time to make it back before dark. At least, that's what I thought. Josh was the type who couldn't resist stopping every few minutes to snap a new picture, wandering just a little too far from the group. Eventually, he called out from a few steps behind. "Hey, guys! Check this out." We turned to see him standing near an old tree, pointing at a wooden sign nailed to its trunk. The wood was weathered, almost blackened with age, and the words carved into it were rough, uneven, like whoever made them had done it in a hurry. The sign read, "Turn back before dark." Laura shifted uncomfortably. "Creepy," she whispered. I checked my watch again. 5:15 p.m. My stomach tightened. "We need to go," I said, my voice sharper than before. No one argued. Maybe it was the way the wind had shifted, or the eerie message on the sign. But they listened. We picked up the pace, walking quickly at first, then jogging. But something felt off. The sun, it was setting too fast. I knew how long it should take for the sky to darken. I had done this hike 100 times before. But somehow, as we moved, the light drained from the sky unnaturally, as if someone had turned down a dimmer switch on the entire forest. Then, about 2 miles in, I saw it. A pile of stones in the middle of the trail. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. That pile. It wasn't there yesterday. It was small, neatly stacked, with each rock balanced perfectly on top of the other. It looked deliberate, like someone, or something, had left it there for a reason. My pulse pounded as I remembered rule number 3. If you see a pile of stones in the middle of the trail, do not touch them. They aren't for you. Josh, the backpacker, stepped closer, curiosity lighting up his face. "Whoa, this is cool," he muttered. "Looks like some kind of ritual site." "Don't touch it," I said quickly, trying to keep my voice calm. Josh frowned. "Relax, man. It's just a pile of rocks." Before I could stop him, before I could even grab his arm, he reached down and kicked one over. And that's when everything changed. The stone didn't tumble forward like it should have. It didn't land in the dirt or bounce to the side. It just vanished. It was like the sky itself had swallowed it. And then, the world stopped. No movement. No sound. Nothing. The rustling leaves, the chirping insects, the distant calls of birds. All gone. The air around us felt heavy. Thick. Almost like it was pressing down on my chest. My ears rang in the silence, the sudden emptiness making my heart hammer against my ribs. Laura's face turned pale. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why did everything just stop?" she asked. I forced a smile. A bad one. We should keep moving. I turned, leading them back the way we came. The rules were clear. If the forest goes silent, leave immediately. We walked fast. No one spoke. I could feel the weight of their fear behind me. The way Daniel kept glancing over his shoulder. The way Laura gripped his arm tighter with every step. 5 minutes passed. That's when Josh whispered, "Guys, we were walking this way earlier, right?" I nodded. "Then why does the path look different?" he asked. I looked up. He was right. The trail had changed. The trees around us were twisted now. Their trunks bending in unnatural directions. Their branches stretching toward one another like fingers trying to interlock. The dirt path beneath our feet was damp. Muddy. Like we had stepped into a swamp that wasn't there before. And then, from somewhere behind us, a soft bell rang. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. My stomach dropped. I froze. So did the others. The sound of the bell floated through the trees. Distant at first. Almost as if it were carried by the wind. But then, it rang again. Closer this time. The metallic chime was hollow. Sharp. And unnervingly loud, echoing through the woods. Its reverberation crawling under my skin. I remembered rule number 2. If you hear a bell ringing in the trees, stop walking and cover your ears. Do not move until it stops. Without thinking, I squeezed my hands over my ears, feeling the pressure of my palms trying to block out the sound. Daniel and Laura quickly followed my lead, pressing their hands against their heads as if trying to shut out something terrible. But Josh didn't. "Guys, what the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The bell rang again, but this time, it was so close. It felt like it was coming from inside my skull, reverberating against my brain, causing a sickening pressure behind my eyes. Josh froze. His face was drained of color. There's someone out there." His voice was barely a whisper, but the panic in it made my heart race. I didn't want to look, but against every instinct telling me to turn away, I made the mistake of looking up. Between the trees, just beyond the reach of the fading sunlight, something was standing there. It looked human, at least from a distance. But once I looked closer, I could tell it wasn't. Its limbs were unnaturally long, impossibly thin, like a spider's legs stretched out too far. Its head was tilted at a sickening angle, as if it couldn't decide whether it should be upside down or sideways. In its eyes, those eyes, they were black, empty pits, swallowing up the light around them. They locked onto Josh, staring directly at him. Then, it smiled. The kind of smile that made my blood turn cold. It wasn't human. There was no warmth to it. No kindness. It was predatory. Josh screamed. He didn't scream like a normal person. It was the kind of scream that made every hair on my body stand on end. A raw, desperate sound that echoed through the trees. The bell stopped. Suddenly, the forest was silent again. The oppressive weight of that silence crushed my chest. I didn't think, I just reacted. "Josh, no!" I yelled, but it was too late. He was already running, straight into the woods. Josh bolted through the trees, his feet pounding against the ground as he ran blindly into the darkening forest. Desperate, terrified. The thing lurched after him. It didn't run. It glided, its long arms reaching forward, stretching toward Josh with unnatural speed. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed Daniel's arm and yanked him forward. "We're leaving. Now." Laura was already moving beside us, her face ashen, but her legs moved without question. We sprinted down the trail, pushing through the thick underbrush, ignoring the burning in our legs, the sharp sting of branches scraping our arms. Behind us, the sound of someone, pushed through the trees, chasing us. It wasn't human. The branches snapped, but they weren't the sounds of the trees moving. It was the sound of something tearing its way through the woods. A horrible, wet tearing noise echoed through the trees, followed by a sickening silence. Josh had stopped screaming. I didn't look back. We pushed forward, faster now, fueled by pure adrenaline. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I didn't dare slow down. We reached the clearing, the entrance to the pass. The second our feet hit the gravel lot, something shifted. The forest changed. The oppressive silence that had followed us was suddenly gone, replaced by the sounds of the forest as if nothing had happened. Birds chirped again. The wind rustled the leaves, and the familiar hum of life in the woods returned. It felt normal. Too normal. But as we stood there, gasping for breath, I realized something else. Josh was gone. There was no sign of him. No trace. It was as though he had never been with us at all. Laura collapsed on the ground, her sobs racking her body. "What the hell was that?" Daniel muttered, his voice hoarse with shock. I didn't answer him. I couldn't. Because that's when I noticed him. Standing just beyond the edge of the tree line, where the shadows stretched long, and the sunlight barely touched, was a man. He was barefoot. His feet were bare, standing in the wet grass, as though he had just walked out of the forest itself. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and his posture was stiff, unnatural. But it wasn't his appearance that sent a chill down my spine. It was the way he stood there, watching us. He was too still, too clean, for someone who had been wandering the depths of the Florida wilds. His clothes were loose and gray, hanging on him in a way that seemed completely out of place. They looked like they had never touched a speck of dirt, as if he hadn't walked through the thick mud of the forest at all. His skin was pale, stretched too tightly over his bones, giving him an unnatural, almost skeletal appearance. But what really made me stop was his eyes. They were locked onto mine, cold and unsettling. And then, he smiled. But it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, far too wide, almost unnaturally so. His face seemed like it was trying to remember how to smile, but had forgotten the right way. It was a grin that didn't belong on a human face. Without a word, he lifted his bare foot, slowly, and stepped backward into the trees. And just like that, he vanished. The moment he disappeared into the shadows, the forest around us seemed to breathe. The wind suddenly kicked up, rustling the leaves as if the entire forest had just exhaled, a collective sigh filling the air. I stood frozen. My body wouldn't move. I couldn't bring myself to take another step, to look away from where he had been. Daniel was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. Who was that? Laura wiped her eyes in disbelief and shook her head slowly. Did you see his feet? She whispered, her voice trembling. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I had seen his feet, and I couldn't shake the image from my mind. He had been barefoot. Yes, but that wasn't what made my skin crawl. He hadn't left any footprints. Not a single mark on the ground. The realization hit me with the force of a punch to the gut. I didn't know what to say. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what we had just witnessed. The woods felt more alive than ever, pressing in on us with an eerie silence. And then, without another word, we ran. We didn't look back. We just ran. The second we reached the parking lot, it was like a spell had broken. The world snapped back into place. The birds were singing again, the wind rustled the leaves, and the forest suddenly felt just like it had been before. All calm and serene. But it wasn't normal. None of it felt normal. We collapsed against my truck, gasping for air, our bodies shaking with adrenaline. My hands were trembling as I gripped the door handle, trying to steady myself. And then, we saw Franklin. He was waiting for us. His arms crossed over his chest. His face as unreadable as always. The moment he saw us, he sighed. It wasn't a relief-filled sigh. It was deep, heavy, and full of disappointment. You broke the rules, didn't you? He said quietly, his eyes never leaving mine. I nodded. Laura looked up at Franklin, her face pale with fear. What about Josh? She asked, her voice tight with worry. Franklin frowned, his brow furrowing in deep thought. Who? The word hung in the air for a moment. Laura froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at Franklin, then back at me. And suddenly, I saw it in her eyes. She realized something I had already felt. She couldn't remember his face anymore. Neither could I. A terrible weight settled in my chest. It was like something heavy had dropped into my stomach. For a second. A horrible, dizzying second. I wasn't sure either. I knew someone had been with us. I could hear his voice, his laughter in my mind. I remembered his name. Josh. But his face? It was already fading. The details slipping through my fingers like sand. I opened my mouth to speak, to say something. Anything. But Franklin was faster. Before I could say a word, he shoved a piece of paper into my hands. The same laminated sheet as before. But this time, there was one more line at the bottom. Rule number 7. If you lose someone in Blackthorn Pass, do not speak their name again. I gripped the paper tightly, my knuckles white. Josh's face is already fading from my memory. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know if he's dead. Or if he's become one of them. One of the lost souls that haunt Blackthorn Pass. But there's one thing I'm certain of. Never break the rules.